Of years ago, the Historic Preservation Commission was asked to weigh in on and approve the removal of the Roger Brooke Tawney bust from City Hall. And that was an initiative that, that began with the City Board of Aldermen and Women. And we have, happy to say we have a representative with us here this evening. And it was an opportunity for us to think about an issue that I think has been discussed and certainly among historians and people who are active in the community, as I would imagine all of you are. It's the kind of thing that you talk about, you think about, but when you're really asked to make a public decision about something like that, you want to make sure you're getting as much information as possible. So Historic Preservation Commission meetings are generally not all that well attended. You may be shocked to hear. But those Historic Preservation Commission meetings were very well attended. We had full houses and lots of comments were made on the record, and all of that is available on the city's website. 2017, so you can go back and you can listen if you weren't there. Some of you I know were there. So it was an interesting opportunity to think about this particular gentleman, his relationship with the city of Frederick, how the Tawney bust ended up in front of City Hall, formerly Courthouse Building, and what that means to our community in the 21st century. Does that represent the city of Frederick? Does that represent the city of Frederick in a way that we want it to represent the city of Frederick? And for those of you that don't know, I'm a professional architectural historian, and I deal with historic buildings and monuments all the time. And there's lots of historic resources that I work with that don't always tell a story that we're happy to tell. So long story short, I had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Greg Kimball, who is our moderator this evening, at a conference in Richmond a couple months ago. He was given the distinguished, but perhaps in many ways unenviable task of serving on the City of Richmond's Monument Avenue Commission. And I think probably most of you are familiar with Monument Avenue, capital of the Confederacy, and there's quite the Southern legacy there. A very challenging resource. I know Dr. Kimball has had to wrestle with that. And so that kind of was the origin of this discussion. And Miss Mary Bowman Crum, who is always trying to hide but is in the back of the room, she and I got to talking into thinking, and we realized that this is more than just an annual meeting discussion. We want to open this up for more of a public forum, if you will. And so what I'd like to do, if I may, is go ahead and call up our speakers this evening. And then you have their bios in the brochure. So what I'm going to ask them instead to do is just to tell you a little bit about how they ended up taking an interest in this issue. And of course, I'm going to start with Dr. Greg Kimball. And Dr. Kimball, other than me accosting you at a conference, you know, if you would just come up for a second and tell folks how you ended up dealing with this topic.
Okay. Well, I'm a historian. I went to the University of Maryland to get my master's in library science, and I've worked in libraries, museums, lots of different institutions, including the National Library of Medicine here in Bethesda and many others. And so my whole career has really been doing public history, as we call it. It's not, there's a certain academic element. I've written on Richmond extensively. I have a book on antebellum Richmond that I wrote. But my passion is talking to people about the communities that they live in and why we should care about all of this stuff. So in terms of my connection, I think, to the topic at hand, for instance, I've also served on a selection committee for an emancipation monument that's going to be dedicated in Richmond, I think in the spring. That was the product of the General Assembly Committee, the Martin Luther King Jr. Commission. I've dealt with lots of issues of public art. I was a consultant for the city on a series of African American interpretations that were around the city, some of which did create considerable controversy. So the other piece of this, and what I really want to talk about tonight in my short presentation at the beginning, is how do we talk to our communities about these kinds of topics?
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. I'm going to break alphabetical here and go local government representative and ask Miss Donna Kazemchak if you would come up and just share just a few sentences about how you ended up being introduced to this topic.
Great fun. Thanks everybody for coming. In 1997 was my very first time that I ran for Board of Aldermen, and at that time Fran Baker was running for mayor. She was the one person on that sitting Board of Aldermen who actually helped me when I went to ask for things, and so she and I campaigned together some. And during our campaigning, she talked about the Roger Book-Taney bust and its effect in the African American community, and the information that she had gotten from many people, and how they wanted it removed. And that's how I got involved in this. It took 20 years. So it's not something that happened overnight. This was a lot of discussion in many different boards of aldermen and through many different mayors. So that's how I got involved, and I'm sure we'll talk more about how we ended up with what we ended up with. Thanks.
Thank you, Donna. Dr. Bohr?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Fred Bohr. I teach art history at Hood College. I teach art history, visual studies, museum studies, and visual theory. And in different ways, my work as a scholar over the last 2 or 3 decades has been about the representation of history. What it gets wrong, what it gets right, what it wants to construe, what it wants to misconstrue, and why. Now, I was trained as a Europeanist, and most of my work is about the Middle East. It's about the archaeological rediscovery of the ancient Near East, for instance, and it's what it looks like in museums in London and Paris and Berlin, things like that. How does that bring me to monuments? Well, we've long talked in academia, and I am an academic, about what it means to be a public intellectual and what it means to take the kind of knowledge and the kind of categories that we talk about all the time and take for granted, and really think about how they might change a community. It might be useful for people to make their own decisions. Monuments, Civil War monuments, monuments per se in America, are a pretty big topic today, and there's a lot one might learn from thinking about how they've been done elsewhere. I'll leave it with that.
Thank you, Dr. Bohr. Mr. Key, Mr. David Key. If you would just tell us a little bit about your take on this topic.
Well, actually, I have walked past that Taney bust many times, and one of the things I think that we miss in history is just being honest about our history in general. It's always been sort of sugar-coated, and I think that as an African American, I needed to talk publicly about the reasons why I thought it should go. I am not a believer of destroying those kinds of things, but there's certain locations that they could go that are far more appropriate than a public place. And I think that sometimes if you're able to put yourself, we were taught as kids to put yourself in the place of someone else. And I think that, again, as an African American, walking past that, especially when it was a courthouse, you wonder if you know about his decision and his thoughts on African Americans. You wonder going into a courthouse, are you going to be treated fairly? It would be, and I say this to put yourself in the place of someone else. Can you imagine you're going into a courthouse and having walking past Malcolm X with a plaque that says by any means necessary. That is sort of the way that I feel when I walk past that. So that was my reason for speaking publicly on that.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. David Perez. Tell us how you ended up here with us this evening.
Thank you again. Thank you for everybody for coming out and watching on the live stream. My name is David Perez, and you know, it's Veterans Day weekend. I'm a veteran. I just want to say happy Veterans Day weekend to all veterans in the crowd or watching, everyone involved. It's very important to me. Actually, that's what segued me into being invited to be a part of this panel tonight. I believe the Taney statue's decision, the overall result of what the issue happened is appropriate, and it's been dealt with. So I think this discussion could lead into more general philosophical viewpoints. I studied philosophy and Middle Eastern studies actually at Hood before transferring over to Shepherd, where I'm at now, for poli-sci and history. But as a veteran, as a history fan, we'll say, I fully believe in preserving the historical nature of these types of things, and that's my focus on this. So when I was invited, and I met the gem, Mary, over there, and fell in love with her, and fell in love with the idea of this discussion, and felt committed to give my input as a veteran who has served in the Middle East, actually, and lived in Germany. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Well, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Campbell, who has a presentation to share with us this evening. Looking forward to it.
Sure. Well, the good news for the people who were at the meeting last night is I never say the same thing twice. It never comes out the same way twice. I never use notes, but hopefully it will be okay. So I was the co-chair of a 10-person commission who were charged with looking at Monument Avenue, and we'll get into what that place actually looks like. So we started our work in 2017 in the fall, maybe actually it was around June or July, and concluded in 2018. The commission was created by the mayor, LeVar Stoney, who obviously responding to what had happened in New Orleans and Baltimore and many other places around the country, wanted to do some, at least look at the monuments. So these are his mandates to us at the very beginning of the process. These are the things he wanted us to consider. But right after our first public meeting, which Dr. Borer, I think, saw on video, and it's pretty exciting stuff, and I don't mean that in a good way, but if you want to watch that video, you can. And I was very disappointed in it. It was about 500 people, and that's another 300 people could not get into the room for that conversation, but it really wasn't a conversation, and that was one of the things that really troubled me about it. Well, not long after we had that meeting, there was the events of Charlottesville, and that really changed the whole dynamic, as it should, for what we were doing. And so here's the statement that Mayor Stoney put out after that occurred, and we had to change. Now, we at the beginning, we were not charged with even thinking about removal, but that was something now that he wanted us to consider. So how did we go about our work? And that's going to be my focus tonight, is how to interact. You know, it's not up to me as a co-chair of the commission, for instance, to make a decision for the community. So how do you engage the community and people who have expertise to come up with solutions in a civilized way? So we had this first commission meeting on August 9th. As I said, it was very stormy. We then decided to do a series of just listening, where we would go to organizations. We went to everybody. We went to Peace Education Center, the Unitarian Church, the NAACP, the Sons of Confederate Veterans. Our opinion was, we can't leave people out of the process. You know, we have to step aside from our personal beliefs and talk to everybody that had a dog in the fight. Those were very interesting meetings and important meetings. One issue we faced there is, I'm sure you have them too, we have public meeting laws. There couldn't be no more than 2 commission members at any of these events. And that meant the 2 people there had to filter that information to the rest of us. I'm not against open meeting laws. I work at an archive. I believe in public information. But that was a difficult thing to work through. Then we had 2 final public meetings I'll describe later in more detail, where we completely changed our process in terms of how we attempted to get public input. There is a commission website, it's still up, and you can go there. There are videos, there's a lot of process stuff in there. You can find out what our final report said, you can go to that and get all of that information. One of the big hurdles we faced was the legal status of what was called war memorials in the language of the code, which goes actually back to 1904, although it's been revised over the years. And it protects war memorials of any war, Vietnam, Iraq, any of them, from being, there's a long list, but modified, taken down, pretty much any modification to them. And in fact, it wasn't until just a few months ago that the Charlottesville court finally ruled that yes, indeed, a statue of General Lee is in fact a war memorial. Now that may seem fairly commonsensical to most of us, but that was litigated, and that was the conclusion of the judge. Again, totally a legal opinion, but under the code, that monument was a war memorial. So, no matter what we recommended, the bottom line is these weren't going anywhere, and they won't until the monument without code is changed. Interestingly, there was a little election earlier this week in Virginia that you might have heard about. So there may be some changes in the offing, but who knows? I don't know what the political will of every member will be in the General Assembly. But certainly, one might imagine there might be some changes coming. We also did another companion website called onmonumentave.com, where we put a lot of our historical information. So Christy Coleman, who is the CEO and president of the American Civil War Museum, who is my co-chair, she, of course, has lots of expertise through her staff, and I do as well at the Library of Virginia. And so we started to build a website just with content. What do the documents actually say about these monuments and how they were constructed? So again, I'll leave that out for tonight. You can go and look at that. Just quickly, how many of you have actually seen Monument Avenue? Okay, a lot of you have. So it is this long, avenue, very stately avenue. It's a neighborhood as well as this monumental thing. And in terms of order, it's rather interesting. So Robert E. Lee is the first monument to be put up in 1890, and at that point, there was no such thing as Monument Avenue. That's important. Nobody built this with the intention of all these monuments being on it. It evolved organically. The next 2 are Jeb Stuart and Stonewall. Who's the other one? Jeff Davis. Were constructed in 1907. Jackson, Montefontaine Maury, this is a person nobody tends to know about unless they're from Virginia. He was called the Pathfinder of the Seas. He was an oceanographer who was kind of the father of the Confederate Navy. And then in the 1990s, Arthur Ashe was added, and that's a whole story into itself. But again, I can't get into all the details. Why is this important? Why is this space important? Well, the whole thing is a National Historic Landmark. I'm not talking about one of the monuments. The entire district is a National Historic Landmark. Very unique, actually. It's one of the few that are themed. And of course, it is the most visible reminder in the place that was the capital of the Confederacy. It definitely is a ceremonial space. I equate these kinds of spaces to, this is the front door to your community. What do you want people to think when they come to your community? What message are you sending? Just a few images of some of the dedications of some of the monuments. Here's Robert E. Lee, Jeb Stuart, cavalry officer. This is the Jefferson Davis Monument. Stonewall Jackson. This is the Maury. Many of these by very important American or foreign sculptors, and Arthur Ashe. So, when we started, we wanted expert opinion, we wanted public opinion. So one of the things we did is say, well, let's see what our historians saying, what our preservation is saying, what our art people who do art history saying. And one of the most important, I think, statements that were made was by the American Historical Association, which was signed on to by a bunch of other organizations. And I think this is one of the key points in their statement on Confederate monuments, that we do need to do that work. We need to consider when they were built, why they were built. They're not just transparent things, as many people think. 24 historical organizations, every major one signed on to that. And also the Association for the Study of African American Life and History did their own statement, which I think is equally important to look at. So just to contextualize this and kind of wrap up some of the history, this shows when, this is the entire state of Virginia, when monuments were erected. So notice where the peaks are. 1880s up through about 1909 in terms of the early 20th century. And then you have another little peak, which is coinciding basically with the Civil Rights Movement. 168 war memorials in Virginia of all conflicts. 81 of this total, 81% of them pertain to Confederate memorials. One of the things I think is really powerful and is said in the Monument Avenue, the AHA statement is all of these were erected at a time, most of them were erected at a time when African Americans did not have a voice in what got built. We look for, it's really hard to get evidence because African Americans, except for newspapers like the Richmond Planet, didn't have a big voice that was very public. But one thing that we do know, for instance, and this is this document you see here, for instance, the House of Delegates, which had quite a few African American delegates in 1875, is right near the end of Reconstruction. Every black delegate voted against the construction costs for installing the first Confederate monument on Capitol Square, which was given by English gentlemen, as it says on the statue, to the Commonwealth of Virginia in 1875, before any of these monuments were built. The other thing to think about is, there's not a lot of subtleties sometimes in these monuments. This is an inscription that you find on the Jefferson Davis Monument. Right to states' rights, essentially, is the argument here. That's no bones about it. That was a core argument of the lost cause. But then, if you turn to the University of Richmond, who digitized actually a 4-volume set that the library had published in the 60s during the centennial of the Civil War, now you can digitally read and access the Virginia secession debates. And I did that. I said, well, let's put in the term slavery. Well, how many am I going to get? 512 references. States' rights, 29. These people knew what they were doing, okay? And people like even John Singleton Mosby, a very famous Confederate general, wrote a scathing letter to a nephew who had sent him some literature for one of these monument dedications. And he said, unblushingly, I knew it was about slavery and so did the rest of those guys. Let's not make stuff up. Let's take responsibility. Now, he had no problem with that. But he was and he became a Republican, actually, which was a good way to get yourself kind of kicked out of the club. So let's talk now quickly about the survey results and the work we did to get input. One of the things we did is online surveying. So we had an open portal on our website that people could contribute to, And we got a lot of responses. I think by this count, 1,456 people commented, and they were asked to go to quite a multi-part question, as you see here, about sort of their attitudes about either removing, adding context, relocating, or just leave the statues alone. And you can see those percentages. Some people wrote essays, which is fine. It was interesting to see people's ideas. This is just another rendering of it, so you can see it in a pie chart. There's a pretty strong middle, and then kind of two outward poles. Here are some of the comments we got. We sort of summarized many of the written comments that we got. And, you know, some of them are were really good, you know, well written and very thoughtful. I should mention there was a really strong military theme. There were people who said, well, and this is an interesting question, right? They said, we think of automatically Virginia soldier must be a Confederate. Well, guess what? There's a state called West Virginia. That was Virginia. Guess what? There were United States colored troops, thousands of which were African American serving in the Union Army. So it begs the question, right? We had a great comment from a retired colonel who said, you know, maybe you should have George Thomas, who was from Southampton County, Virginia, took the same oath to the U.S. military that Robert E. Lee did, but guess what? He said, no, I'm not fighting for any Confederacy. I took an oath. And he was a slaveholder. His family basically, you know, turned his classic thing. They turned his portrait to the wall. He was the Rock of Chickamauga. He fought bravely in the American Civil War. Where's his monument? That's the question that the colonel asked. Then he has a lot of things with context, interpretation. You know, we should keep this. You know, some of these arguments are not just black and white. Maybe we do need to keep them, but interpret them so thoroughly that we really understand the implications of what these things mean. So lots of different ideas. Actually, that fallen monuments thing, if I don't know if any of you have ever been to these places in Eastern Europe, guess where all the Lenin and Stalin statues are? Some of them have been literally stuck in these parks outside cities where you can go, and it's kind of surreal, really. Again, a lot of really, really interesting commentary. We also asked people, so we didn't want to just talk about taking things down. We wanted to talk about, well, who do you want to see memorialized in our city? And you see that big Maggie Walker, well, she did get her statue. In fact, it was done by a Marylander. I'm trying to remember his name, the artist that did her statue, which is now right on Broad Street. If some of you may not know her, she was one of the earliest, well, probably definitely the earliest African-American bank president in the United States. A very, very, very interesting woman, important. You see Gabriel Prosser, who plotted an insurrection in Richmond in 1800. Elizabeth Van Lew, anybody know who that is?
Yeah, she's a spy.
Hmm?
Ran spy, she was a spy.
That's right, a Union spy. Oliver Hill, a civil rights leader. So very interesting. These are some of the groups or ideas that they wanted to see memorialized. And the scale of the letters represents the number of people who were for those. That revolving art installations is an interesting one. I'll return to that in a minute. So I'll wrap up with the public meetings that we held in May of 2018 at the end of the process. So as I said, the first big public meeting we had, completely open public meeting, did not go well in my mind, and I think in most people's minds. And it was kind of the standard, watch videos, for instance, of some of the commission and other meetings here in Frederick about the Tawny, which were far less emotional. But I heard some of the same arguments that I heard in Richmond. So how do you then get past that instead of people simply lecturing the alderman or the commission to actually have an engagement with people? We actually hired a professional facilitator, and it was one of the best things we did, because I don't want to be running a meeting where I should be listening to people. I don't want people then to be talking to me, trying to convince me that they are right. We hired a really great professional facilitator. We also did something that I was skeptical of at first, but we had the little clickers. People could, in real time, vote. And this is actually the results of that. And we asked questions at the beginning of the meeting before anything happened, and then at the end. And so what you see here is the first, the blue is people's reaction to these statements made at the very beginning of the meeting, and the sort of orangey color there is how they voted at the end. What is the major difference you see there? Yes, you see big movement in, at least to add interpretation and context to the monuments. Really, the outside numbers, except for keep the existing monuments as they are, that goes down. Even, I'm not sure, of course, I'm not sure what is best. The remove doesn't change. That's kind of interesting, right? So that was, again, just one data point in how we're looking at this. Whoops, there we go. We also did a fair amount of education. A lot of people don't know how these were built, or when they were built, or why they were built. And so we engaged people on that level. Thankfully, a lot of them felt like that was useful. I guess if you put the good amount and some together, you get something like 63%. I'll take that. And this is a key one for me. People need to be heard. When you cut off processes and just make arbitrary decisions, those things don't go away. Those continue to exist in your community. And they can really be bad. So I am very happy that we got this resolved, because I think a lot of people, no matter what they believe, that's one of the key things. They want to be heard and feel like people in authority are listening to them. And then, as we'll talk later, what's the role of people who are experts, people in historic preservation, historians like me? For instance, if you are in historic preservation, you take very seriously your duty to be a steward of artifacts. These things are important. Somebody thought it was important to build a giant statue of Robert E. Lee. As a historian, that's an important thing. Like, that tells me something about the culture it was built in. Doesn't mean it has to be in any particular place, but it does need to be preserved. And then I have my other part of this is, so how do we do other kinds of projects? Where do we go from here in terms of how we do commemoration and talk about history? This is a great example from Baltimore, right? This is what now, well, I don't know if, well, I shouldn't say now, I haven't been to Baltimore in a few months, but this is what was installed after Tawny was removed from Baltimore. There was interpretation to say, why do we have this plinth with nothing on it? And another thing I'm really interested in is a lot of cities are doing public art that is sort of impermanent, more spontaneous, more human scale. And I think that's an interesting move. My 3 kids, all of whom are under 30, have no interest in monumental statues of military figures. Their interests in art are very, very different than ours probably are. I think Philadelphia's Monument Lab is a really good example of temporary installations. And I see this maybe as something people are moving towards. 100 years from now, there'll be people who will say things about us that we're saying about Robert E. Lee. They're going to say, what was wrong with these people to incarcerate the highest number of people of any country on this planet? And we live with it every day. We walk around like that's not happening, unless you're really affected, unless your family members are in jail. You know, that's pretty shocking. And people are going to call us on that down the road. So maybe it is better not to have these giant permanent things. There's a lot of things going on in Richmond. I'll leave with this. There's a new commission, History and Culture Commission, which I hope will carry forward some of the ideas that we had in our work. And this is coming to Richmond. Andy Wiley's Rumors of War is going to be installed at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts after its display here in New York. So that, I hope, frames a little bit of what we're talking about. I want to encourage, particularly, I know Fred has experience with many other places. This is just one experience. It doesn't necessarily apply perfectly to any other place. There is no other place that looks like Monument Avenue in this country, really. So it is in that sense different, but in the same sorts of ways, it's also very similar to the kinds of conversations that you've been having. So let's get to the conversation part, and I invite my fellow panelists to come up. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to do this as, I hope, informally as we can. You know, I've told the panelists I want to encourage them to speak to each other, to have a dialogue. Like, I don't want to be, my job is just to facilitate the conversation with a few questions to prompt. Yeah, so let's get rolling. And thank you all for being here tonight. And I've just met all these people that I'm moderating. It's kind of a strange thing. But it's okay. So my first question is, so as we sit here today, quite a number of pieces of public art sit in warehouses or storage yards, including several in Maryland. Do we have to share the values of the past to recognize the value of preserving public art, even if they reveal a dark history that makes many of us uncomfortable? The debate in Frederick, the nation, and around the world seems to have boiled down to a predictable range of choices, many of which I've laid out here. What are your thoughts on solutions to some of these issues that we face? And please, I don't think we have to stand on ceremony to answer in order, but anyone want to jump in on that? Yes, Fred?
Sure. Is it a predictable range of choices, the choices that we have to deal with this? I don't think it's so predictable at all. First of all, I don't think we know what will happen in the future. But second of all, there are lots of things we could do with monuments. Things that haven't been done, or versions of things that have been done. You got Sanford Levinson's book, it's called Written in Stone. It's a book by a legal scholar in Texas. It lists 9 different possible things you might do with a monument, not just 3 or 4. And even how you do the predictable ones, i.e. contextualize or move, those can all be done in different ways with different significances as well. So I don't think it's so predictable, number one. Number two, there's a couple things, since we're talking there's a lot of things that one could say about this, but just to try to stick to this topic and this monument in particular, here's 2 things that maybe you haven't thought of, or maybe you have. First of all, any bronze sculptor can tell you that bronze can be melted down and remade. We could remake something out of those monuments, something for today instead of something for the past. Monuments are moved and changed and taken apart all the time. There's nothing sacrosanct about them, any of them. Their monuments have been destroyed on American soil that didn't bother anybody, and nobody said somebody lost their heritage. When the revolutionaries destroyed a statue of George III in New York City, did this bother anyone? When you watched those statues of Saddam Hussein go down in Iraq, did anybody say we were losing Iraq's heritage? And there's a million more examples like this. There's nothing sacrosanct about monuments, and a lot we can do with them. So that's one thing. So turning them into something else is something we could do. Another possibility, especially since you mentioned you kind of like living monuments or other kinds of temporary things. You know, there's an artist who calls himself Dred Scott, who in fact this weekend is involved in a performance. We might do things in public with the monuments we have here as well. In fact, Dred Scott actually has one piece that's called Decision, about the Dred Scott decision, which was premiered a couple of years ago in Brooklyn. There's a million things we could do about them. And of course, we don't have to choose one or the other, whether it's a permanent or a not permanent one. And since you get to one other thing about this that I don't want to forget, saying that, well, we don't really want to have public monuments anymore, the age of these permanent monuments is over, is a funny thing to hear. I'll tell you a little story from my discipline, the history of art. In the late 80s and early 90s, women artists began to have monographs, you know, big, what we call monuments in my field. They began to be made about them. And at exactly the same moment, many people said, we don't believe a monograph makes any sense anymore. Exactly at this, in effect, disenfranchising a new class of artists who just began to be written about. Saying the same thing today about monuments disenfranchises the people of color and other marginalized groups who are just beginning to maybe have a tiny bit of voice in making monuments, not intentionally, but effectively. I don't really think that, so saying that has its own really significant public and political overtones that I don't think we should ignore. And the people who chose to put the Kehinde Wiley monument up there, I think they probably agreed with me. Oh, and I have a question to you about Kehinde Wiley too, and I will stop talking. Where the Kehinde Wiley monument is being placed, Rumor of War, as I understand it, is on an axis with Arthur Ashe. Is that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
what is now in fact Arthur Ashe Boulevard.
Right. So in
Yeah.
effect, here is an alternative axis of monuments being created out of Monument Avenue, and a permanent one. And further, it's also one, as you could kind of see, although I don't think you mentioned it, that is an exact parody of the Jeb Stuart monument. It's an exact parody of it, with the same tail blowing in the wind, except this time, instead of a tough Confederate general, it's a young black man with a top knot, a hoodie, and ripped jeans. Astonishing. If creating public permanent monuments to create new directions means nothing, we wouldn't be doing that.
Thank you. Great.
Well said.
Well said indeed. I actually had a slide of George III being torn down, and I had to take it out, but for time.
Yeah.
But it's true.
Happens to me all the time.
It's an excellent image. It's a very dramatic image. Would anybody else like to take on that question?
I think the discussion of monuments and public art does need to happen. Different types of art happen at different points in time, and I think we all want to see public art of our time, and we want to see public art of the past. The difference that I see in Confederate statues being called public art, which they certainly were, but as you showed on your slides, they were public art that was put in place at a time when we were giving African Americans the right to become people, and the right to vote, and the right to go to a school that had people who didn't just look like them in it. And all of a sudden, we're starting to build these things. You can't ignore that. And if you choose to ignore that, then you are in fact ignoring history. So, art changes. I love the fact that we're talking about this alternate in Richmond. Here in Frederick, we don't have so much of that. The one statue that we talked about that was a piece of public art was placed in front of what at one point in time was the courthouse, and now is City Hall, which is the place where we do the business of the people. And if the people can't be comfortable walking into that building, there's a problem. So I kind of see they're really two different things. Public art and it's changing in society, and these Confederate monuments, which are most were done for purposes of putting people down.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I agree with most of it. I don't think that disregarding the historical nature is necessarily there intentionally nowadays. That's where the idea of contextual placement is more appropriate, I think. Yes, if there is a governmental process and people step up and have their legal right at a public hearing and express interest to have these things moved or displaced, and then that is approved by the governing body, I fully support that. That is the legal process that you described in your commission description and in any other form of body of government. I fully agree with that. The problem is sometimes these public hearings can be, I guess for lack of a better term, filibustered. And people from other areas that have no real impact or effect upon themselves take a stance to take over these hearings and say, to support one agenda or the other. And I really feel as though that the idea that you had mentioned, bringing in a professional facilitator was a great one. You can't really do that all the time for public hearings in a governmental body, especially like the Board of Aldermen, let's say. But when we're talking about your very big issue on the commission side, I thought that was amazing. The statistical data that you showed was amazing and probably pretty accurate, especially like I think Carrie mentioned in her opening remarks, they had more attendance ever at their foundation meetings and their commission meetings regarding this specific statute in Frederick than ever before, because it's so controversial. You know, we need to consider when we're talking about these monumental issues, public art issues, history in general, you know, because there's an issue in Kansas City right now where the Martin Luther King Boulevard's name was changed back to represent Paseo, King Paseo, and it's a very contentious issue, something that I don't agree with personally, because we're taking away from a man that was on for his positive attributions or contributions to society, you know. And I think in this community we need to focus more on education and contextual premises over anything else, and that's lacking, obviously. So.
Just quickly, I want to say we struggle mightily with how to define community, because there are lots of communities, and that's a very unsubtle way to. But I mean, we can't force people to come to public meetings,
Right.
But you do have to think about who is coming, and like you say, we certainly experienced the filibustering that you mentioned. Is Monument Avenue? Should we give preference to the people who live on Monument Avenue? Is it the city? Is it only people who live within the city boundaries? Is it? This is an internationally known artifact. Who gets to say? And what does that community look like?
I always have to look closely at the double standard. That's from my point of view, and I think I have to admit that first question was very surprising, or I had to consider what you were asking, because a lot of those monuments were erected at the time of the segregation and Jim Crow era, and meant to promote white supremacy and at the same time intimidate African Americans, and so when you know, and in today's world, negotiation and understanding other people is so critical. And I go back to Tawny. I remember in that public hearing, I heard things like destroy it, take it out to the landfill, that kind of thing. And at the same time, one of the things that struck me about that particular issue was we have Roger Book Tawny has here, and suggested that maybe that should be the place that it should go. And actually, it was a hot potato. Nobody wanted it there. So I mean, again, in my mind, you know, we hear people talk about changing history, and those folks who argue that point, want to ask, is this what we want to tell future generations? This is as far as we went, and this is the best that we could do. And I think that for me, it's like negotiating those kinds of things, that understanding that if you remove this, you're going to get those people who feel that way dug in, and they're not going to change their mind at all, and you're never going to be able to have a discussion. And so destroying is not the thing that I would suggest. And at the same time, there are, to me, to alleviate a lot of that is have some of those monuments in museums where people have a choice to go see and study as much as they want. Those who are offended by it don't have to go. It's sort of a simple, to me it's simple. But again, I think that each situation you have to pay very close attention and not lose people along the way. And that is very easy to do when you get into these kinds of discussions.
And I think you are going to lose people along the way. And you talked about how we have some statues, busts, monuments in warehouses or in closets, or just in hiding in places. Well, the fact is, most of what we have in the Smithsonian is not seen by the public.
Sure.
That gets changed around all the time. So having these in a warehouse somewhere, in my mind, is no different.
Well, I
would melt some of them down, definitely.
Yeah.
But I understand wanting to preserve what was. I also think that we need to move toward something better. And we're going to be judged, as you say, by mass incarceration. I'm completely with you there. Then one would hope that we would be doing what we can to change that now, so that we are moving in the right direction in the future. This is part of that.
What I really meant in terms of the warehouses is, frankly, what we're really talking about there, as far as I'm concerned, it's different being in the Smithsonian to being out in a yard covered by a tarp. And frankly, I would imagine that some of these monuments will basically probably fall apart from benign neglect, and you might be fine with that. But I mean, personally, I'm not. One of the greatest, I would say greatest, but one of those important artifacts in our entire collection at the library is Virginia's Ordinance of Secession. It's a pretty damn important art. It articulates why Virginians, white Virginians, decided we're going to go to war and kill off. The number keeps going up. We're up to like 700,000 people. Is it okay? I can just destroy that? Is that just because we know what it says, right? Why does the artifact even mean it?
That's not a monument. That's a historical artifact, and I'm not sure they classed in the same way. We can have 1,000 of them, and they can be put someplace in an archive and taken care of. We're talking about gigantic, vast things. I'm amazed you're all talking about them as art, by the way. Almost they're worthless as art. Many of them are machine-made, or made in factories in upstate New York. Remember when they tore down the statue and the thing that was in front of the Durham County Courthouse? Remember what it looked like? It fell apart. It was made of nothing. Why should we maintain any of those? A few of them, a very, very few, are made by artists who sort of have some name as artists. And if they went to museums, which are full of unsavory other things from other times in history, that's be fine with me. Most of them are worthless as art. And I'm amazed that you're talking about them in terms of art at all, honestly.
So you don't think the is art?
The which? Which
The
one?
one I showed, the Lee Monument on Monument Avenue. Brissier was a minor league artist?
The first thing that comes to mind, again, think about it as a museum. Think about it as a Smithsonian. Okay, every museum, Don is absolutely right, shows you 1 or 2% of what it has in its collection. If you put it in some sort of storage somewhere, you could still call it art, and we could have to not see it. And if I'm not mistaken, which again, from an artistic standpoint, is fine with me. But what people say is beautiful is a totally subjective thing.
Yes.
I think one other thing you didn't mention that I think is the case about your commission the city of Richmond did come to a conclusion about what to do about Monument Avenue, right? That had to do with
No, we didn't actually.
contextualizing and
Yes.
removing and, or am I wrong?
No,
Yeah.
so, because of the legal problem, we made certain proposals that fit within that framework. We said,
Yeah,
like, for instance, Jefferson Davis, of course it would go. And it was, this is, well, let's
Yeah.
segue into one of my other questions here. So let's.
Okay.
Okay. So, no, really, seriously, I think this is an interesting question, and again, we had a certain view of it, and it's reflected in the report. How much do I weigh, again, my personal feeling or the other non-commissioners about what ought to, based on my knowledge of history, et cetera, or your knowledge of art, can I finish? And how much do I respect that public input that I got that did not say to remove all of them?
right. How much do you respect it? Well,
How much do you weigh it in terms of, if you're actually in the position to have to make decisions about these things,
Well-
who gets to have the say in
Okay,
what
I
happens?
am.
Okay, great question.
I'm in that position, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
I have to make decisions at every single meeting that weigh the input of people at those meetings, of people who send emails, of people who make phone calls, of people I meet in the grocery store who have something to say to me. How much do I weigh it? Well, of course you weigh it a lot. The fact is, they put you in office because they believe you're going to do mostly what's right. You're never going to agree 100% with anybody, but as a person who has been put in that position of making decisions for a city by people in that city, yes, absolutely I listen to public comment, and absolutely I have changed my mind on how I was voting on the night of a hearing because of what people said. But I also listened for the last 20 years. And I've heard what many, many other people have said. Some disenfranchised people who are less likely to come and speak at those meetings because numerous reasons. But there are people who, they're afraid to come and speak at the meetings because they will get abused. I guess they are intimidated. Yes, they're very intimidated.
Let me ask you this, because I don't know much about the Frederick situation. I'm interested in it. I read various news reports and I watched some of the footage from some of the meetings that you had. What other kinds of input did you read? Any formal processes of input were done here beyond the public comment at some of the commission and other meetings?
We had to, once the legislation was put forth, it was open for public comment by anyone until the vote actually happened. So the amount of public comment that we got on that was massive, and it wasn't just at, it was at commission meetings, it was at public art commission meetings, it was at mayor and board voting meetings, it was at mayor and board workshops, it was in emails, it was, again, standing in the grocery store, grabbing something off the shelf, somebody grabbing my arm saying, "You have lost your mind." Somebody else coming up and giving me a hug saying, "Thank you for being so brave." So, lots and lots of public.
Very great conversation so far, and a couple things I did want to bring up, but one, the subjectivity of things. When we're talking about the subjective nature of these things, I think interpretation is also of subjective nature. So to contextualize these things, I think, is more appropriate. Education, dialogue, communication, these panel discussions, things of that nature, encouragement of youth to get involved with this kind of stuff. It's a dying art. History is a dying art. We all know that. Most people say, "What are you going to do with that degree?" Well, I don't know. They said that to me when I was a philosophy major. I could do anything I want because I'm not going to school to get a profession. I'm going to school to learn. And that is not a common trend in the youth of today, and I am one of those. I'm kind of young here. So that's one thing I wanted to bring up. Thank you. The second thing was, it is assumed that in politics, the individuals elected are expected to make an unbiased, common decision based off of the information they have from the general public. I guess we can say as community instead. The general public that influences those things sometimes are from this area and sometimes they're not, and that's not illegal either. the mediums in which they get that public comment is not illegal either. But when you have a full majority on a deciding body of government, how real or how unbiased is that decision really made? When you don't have input from the other side of the spectrum like we do here tonight, like we do with this issue of the Taney statue. Obviously, we have opposing viewpoints expressed. The governing bodies cannot be bipartisan, let's say. It's you know, and most of the people with opposing views don't feel comfortable coming on other issues as well because of that, because of possible intimidation. You know, we had a recent issue that had nothing to do with monuments or art that I attended a 3-hour session of public comment. 3 hours. You know? Twice, yes, it was twice, but the one I attended was 3 hours, and the minority group were the supporters of the local business, mind you, because most of the people didn't feel as though their voice would be heard. So I challenge each and every one of you to not assume that just because these individuals in power that are making the decisions are always going to be, as collaborative or understanding as we are here today.
I find it interesting, and I mentioned this last night, figuring that people probably throw food at me. But again, as a historian, Roger Taney, we're focusing on.
I didn't have any food.
Oh, that's right.
I would have.
Roger Taney was not like the guy. All but 2 of the Supreme Court justices said he was right. Guess what? The Constitution has the 3/5 clause. It has the early form of the Fugitive Slave Act embedded in it. I mean, as a legalism, Taney probably thought he was exactly doing the right thing, and you could interpret the law at that particular time, if you were a strict constructionist, to say that he was right. As a legal matter, of course, it was a disastrous from a human point of view. It was disastrous from a political point of view, but I don't necessarily, I want to have a little more systematic process to gain people's input before I claim to be able to represent a community in terms of their decision making.
Well, I think that's established over the years of this country since when he was in office as a Supreme Court Justice, and what we have nowadays is already there. Obviously, we've grown as a nation. And if we look at historical monuments and public art and all these other things that we're discussing tonight, you know, the Revolutionary War is what determined this nation, which created it. The Civil War is what kept us alive and kept us going, you know, and has now given us the ability to be able to hear all sides of the story, you know, and to get inputs from all sides and respect other people, you know. I do not think that just because there's a monument that I feel as though we need to preserve, I respect or just, you know, agree with the person's positions on some political endeavor or some very, very atrocious historical acts. I don't agree with that at all. You know, it is not about that.
Well, I have some still stuck a little bit on the public art as well, and one of the things that and I have it actually in my notes, but was given how these statues came about, to put that, to even use the term public art. I remember back in the 8th grade, my 8th grade teacher, Miss Addison, who Rose would know as well, would have down very, very hard on us calling this public art. She would say Rembrandt, Dali, a whole host of artists. But again, I think that one of the things too is to get the kind of public comments and from a wide range of ideas. One of the things that has always bothered me as far as the way we live, we live in sort of dual worlds in a way, and I can remember back some time ago when going back into the 60s when there was issues going on in Frederick. We need to talk to the leaders of the black community, and it would be 2 people. In fact, there's 2 of us here today. And I share this, you know, to get the kind of input that we're talking about. I'm only here because I have done this before, and I'm comfortable with talking to people. But there are a lot of people who are not, and would never feel that their voice would be heard. To this day, we deal with this all the time. And in fact, I have to share. Just the other night, we went to another function, Rose and I, and after that meeting, a gentleman came up and talked about, kind of congratulated us in a way that I was kind of shocked, both of us were, in that he said something like, "I thank you folks for coming here. You must, to be in this situation with all of these white people," and he said, "I'm Jewish, by the way," so he kind of could relate. But this is what we're used to. So again, you're not going to get, and I always have to say at the very beginning, I'm not representing my race. I'm talking strictly from my point of view. And if they were here and felt that their voices could be heard, they would have all sorts of different thoughts on the process. But this is the results of the same things we're talking about here. We need to get to a place where not only do we feel that everything is being upfront and honest. You know the term, and I hate to get stuck on the term of public art, but to me, when I first saw that term, you know what came to my mind? Black Lives Matter. I said, oh, this is one of those buzzwords, because we changed Black Lives Matter into Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, and in my world, it was never a time when those 2 lives didn't matter. But again, I think that in the world that I live, we see people turning words around, sanitizing words, using them against what the purpose was all the time. So to get to the point where we can even trust that and feel comfortable that our voices is going to be heard, it's going to take a while. I can tell you just quickly, the very first time that I realized that we had a voice was we were part of the Lincoln Alumni Association, the only African American high school that we could go to in this town. During desegregation, that school became an elementary school, and they changed the name. For 40 years, every time we had a reunion, we moaned and groaned about it. They took our school's name away, and every class that ever graduated had a problem with that. We created the Lincoln Alumni, went to the Board of Education, and proposed that historically it's important to bring this school's name back. It was unanimous. It was the first time that we ever thought that anybody, and I can tell you, everybody that when we suggested that, every person in my school said that will never happen. And so you're dealing with sort of a universal world, but not the same. So I don't know how to explain that any better, but again, I think that it's really important that we get to a place where we understand why we're so few when in these kinds of situations.
Do you see a difference in terms of generational difference? Because I certainly do in Richmond. So when I moved to Richmond in 1986, there were like 5 people who would get together at the Commonwealth Club and decide what was going to happen in the city. I mean, literally. Today, well, about 3 years ago, there was this proposal to build this big old baseball stadium on the top of the second largest slave trading market in the United States. And people rose up and said, no, you're not going to do that. And it like you, it's one of the first times I saw people really embrace their power, and it was really led by a lot of young people. So I hope that's changing. I don't know what it's like here, but.
I think we have a way to go yet.
Okay, all right.
I agree with that.
I know, Fred, you've been anxious to speak for a while.
Yeah, well, I'm used to it. I'm trying to think of something productive and political that I could say. I loved hearing your, let's go back to the session that you chaired in Richmond of people speaking about the monument that you were saying was kind of a mess. I loved it. I thought it was a tremendous success. I absolutely loved it. It was all kinds of people were there. They were black and white, and they were young and old, and they were radical, and some of them had written out things for 3 weeks, and they read them very carefully. And others of them had been walking by and just spoke. And that cacophony is what a real city and a real place and a real community is like. Is it hard to keep them in line? Yeah. That's what a real place is like too.
That really wasn't my problem. The problem was,
And it got you
I heard every
speak.
single thing I heard in that meeting before. I didn't learn a damn thing
I think
from that meeting.
I think the people in that community learned a lot from hearing everyone else.
Maybe.
And you also, I was going to actually laud you about this, and yet you did come to some set of decisions that the city made. I think that is terrific. I think that's actually kind of an amazing, an exemplary thing, especially in a city like Richmond with such heavy-duty issues involved around these kind of things. I think that is absolutely great. And yet, at the same time, about 2 months ago, I heard a woman talking on the radio about Confederate monuments, a woman who identified herself as African American. And she said, I feel, looking at Confederate monuments makes me feel the way I think a Jew would feel like looking at a Nazi monument. And Donna just mentioned something about giving, say in places like courthouses or public squares, giving everyone equal access to a public place, making everyone part of a community, which is what we're struggling with here as well. That is not an argument for maintaining works of art or maintaining objects per se. I'm thinking about the DeKalb County Courthouse outside of Atlanta, which has about a 35-foot high thing, which has just been recontextualized. And there are these long labels about the lost cause, about the lies of that monument. And yet, to any visual person, there's still a gigantic 35-foot spire that says white supremacy spoken here, that you cannot look at that monument without staring at that thing. What would it be like to take that away? What would it be like for the people who live there? It would be a revelation. You can't not read descriptions of what Richmond, when Abraham Lincoln visited Richmond the day after its liberation. The descriptions of what that was like are astonishing, especially for African Americans. We can't do that again, and let's not go back to doing that again.
There was a little fire that day.
And there's,
that
well,
was a couple days before.
that's right. The Confederates had set a lot of it on fire before they left. That's right.
They're the ones who said it.
Much of which has never been monumentalized and is still, I believe, not really properly spoken in that place. At least according to people that I read.
Just a sub note to that,
Yeah.
because it's a really interesting
Uh-huh.
point. There actually was proposed in the 1930s a WPA mural
Oh.
in Richmond
Yeah.
for the post office, and it was going to be at the Fall of Richmond. And guess who said, no, we can't do that? The United Daughters of the Confederacy.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah.
It would have been probably an amazing piece, but that was taboo.
So maybe we could try again.
Yeah, sure.
And these are the same Daughters of the Confederacy, again, correct me if I'm wrong, who celebrate what's it called, our President's Day.
Yeah.
Every year, it used to be around Monument Avenue. And since Arthur Ashe was put up there, they don't like being around black people, and they've moved it, right, to the cemetery. A really striking example of how permanent monuments change the public sphere and switch it to something that's probably more like neutral and less like controlled by the white aristocracy of this place.
Gee, I shouldn't have cut some of my slides.
Yeah, that was in your thing too, okay. well.
No, I'm just kidding. What was in there though, and I think it gets to your point, all the points you guys have made, is that this was very conscious. The United States of the Confederacy patrolled systematically every textbook that any Southern child read. And it literally, they had a book that told you what couldn't be in there. And one of them, for instance, was states' rights. Another was that slaves were happy in the antebellum South. I mean, this is not like a secret. This is not a secret. This was all laid out in published works. Like, this is not a mystery to somebody who actually reads historical material. So to your point, 1902 is the Underwood, the Constitution of Virginia overthrowing the Underwood Constitution, where again, the delegates are very open what they're doing. We're going to disenfranchise black people. That's pretty much what they talk about. And that's what they did. And that's only 12 years after the Lee Monument, 5 years before the next two monuments.
And part of the same process as erecting the monuments.
Yes.
That's probably the most important thing. The people who did it, they're gone. But the monuments are still there with that same force, and they're what we have to reckon with.
Exactly.
So what if-
We shouldn't run from it.
Well, we should not run from it, we should say who we are somehow. So what if, okay, so let's give you all that, and let's say we can do it. What if we removed, well, there are 40 monuments to Nathan Bedford Forrest, maybe the worst of the worst. I won't spend time telling you who he is. There are 40 monuments to Nathan Bedford Forrest in the South. There are something like 28 in his home state of Tennessee, which is more than all three of the presidents who came from Tennessee put together. And as you maybe know, the monument in Memphis, in what was called Forest Park, named for him, they renamed Forest Park something else, and they got rid of that. The city of Memphis got rid of that one. Sort of like the city of Richmond. Except it's probably a poorer city than Richmond, and it's a much more anyway. So now there are only 39 monuments to Nathan Bedford Forrest in the South. The city of Memphis, as you also maybe know, was penalized by the state of Tennessee for removing that monument to the tune of $750,000, because the next year was the year for it celebrating its history. What if we got rid of half of all the Confederate monuments and only had 500,000? What if there were only 20 monuments to Nathan Bedford Forrest? That would get rid. What if there were only 10 or 5? Would these be terrible things? These would open up lots and lots of public space while still doing the job of whatever historians think should be done. Now, I'm amazed that I'm hearing myself speak against whatever history is, but whatever history is what we make it now. And no historian who really knows history will tell you anything different.
I just want to check. I know we're getting up onto our time here. It's been a great conversation. Do we want to take any audience questions before we wrap up? Are we supposed to go to 7:30, Carrie?
Yes.
Okay. Would that be a good time to do that? Yeah, I want to hear what maybe a few of you have to say as well. Sir?
So your mention of repurposing monuments brings to mind a quote from Ward Nickens, who was a local African-American leader who I guess passed away 99 years old. And in oral history, he said, you should melt down Roger Time and make it into a boot scraper. It's very interesting. And I've said this before in meetings, I would like to propose it again, and this Veterans Weekend is an appropriate time to do it. I wish we would erect a monument to African-American soldiers, the USCT soldiers from the Civil War. There were a lot of them from Frederick, and we got to recognize them.
That was another suggestion. We got a lot of suggestions for honoring United States Colored Troops units or individuals. We have, for instance, from Norfolk, the color bearer in the 54th Massachusetts, who is one of the few Union monuments in the entire state of Virginia, and it's in an African-American cemetery in Norfolk.
I would wholeheartedly suggest that as well for part of the War Monument Historical Preservation. That's my opinion. Give credence to everybody that has served at any point in time, to include women, especially in World War II. We need more World War II representation, not just Civil War, despite there being or not being representation from Frederick. I think the contentious issues related to Vietnam are valid, but they stand to right. You know, the new monuments in DC are perfectly acceptable and knowledgeable, but what we have here in Frederick is just Korean War and Vietnam. That was it. You know.
Women fought in the Civil War too, thank you.
Yep.
All the wars. Yes.
They did.
I believe it greatly so.
Yes?
I have a question. I'm curious about the discussions on Monument Avenue as a streetscape and as a historic district. And I wondered if that was touched on at all.
Well,
because what I wonder is, so this is a street, interestingly, as your conversation has unfolded, I think a lot of people wouldn't have been very comfortable walking down that street, perhaps. And it sounds like, you know, the Daughters of the Confederacy essentially patrolled it, maybe. I don't know. But on the other hand, it's a street that has a lot of history. It's a National Historic Landmark. If they're all removed, it may not be a landmark anymore. I wonder if that was of any concern or interest to anybody?
Oh, it definitely was. So one of the two city council people who represented parts of Monument Avenue were also on the commission. And of course, they were hearing lots of things from that community. It is a tricky business, but it's interesting. The Lee Monument was solicited by this guy named Allen, who was building basically a, housing, like it was a real estate deal. And he thought, wow, this would be great, to have Lee right here, right? So, and even Fitzhugh Lee, who I believe was the nephew of Robert E. Lee, was the governor. It's a state monument, by the way. It is not owned by the city. The Commonwealth of Virginia owns the Robert E. Lee Monument. So there were two warring factions, women and men, interestingly, who were going back and forth. They had different artists in mind. So Fitzhugh Lee just was really frustrated. He said, just give us the money. We'll do this thing. We'll get this done. So he says in a letter, this is essentially a real estate thing. Like this is an amenity in a way to construct this. So there's these wonderful maps, real estate maps, to solicit people to live there, that before the monument's even put up, it has the monument like stuck right here. So, again, there's all kinds of factors that go into these things, but it was a big consideration for us. This is really kind of a unique situation. Yeah. It's not like an individual statue. It's not like it's really, that's the part of this is very unique. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Some of what I've heard in talking to people I know about all of this, they seem to be very focused on it's historical. You don't mess with the monument because it's historical. It's a historical monument. You mentioned that. So is it historical because it is old when it was built, or it's historical because it depicts a human being that was part of a historical event?
So in the city of Frederick, the Historic Preservation Commission actually controls certain what can be put in different places and how buildings can be changed, etc. And there is a period of significance. And this, in our case, the Roger Bertani statue, I believe, was put up in 1939, which is not our period of significance. So
I will tell you why it's a historical monument. Because people say it's a historical monument.
Yeah.
That's what history is made of. History is a discourse. It's not historical because it's old. Old has nothing to do with history. The past has nothing to do with history. History is a plot that we create now for what it is that matters for us. And if we are changing, our history needs to change. To say that you can't erase history is nonsense. That's true, you can't erase history. Taking down a monument you can do. You can't erase history. Think of all the histories, well, we can disagree with, think of all the histories that are erased right now. Think of all the, I visited Hampton Mansion outside Baltimore a while ago, and I learned that Mr. Ridgely had built this house, and then he built that over there. I learned the meals that Mr. Ridgely served to her guests, and I realized Mr. Ridgely never built a thing, and Mr. Ridgely never served a thing. The histories of how those happened are erased in this place. The histories of the hundreds of enslaved people who made those happen are totally erased. There's so much more like this. If we can begin to, and the job of unerasing is possible to some extent, if that's what we want to do. But that's us making our history, finding, as they say, a usable history. History is not something that is inherited, that must be repeated. That's, people like that, they major in something like that, then they don't get a job. If you actually learn history, you can learn how to make history and what history is.
Which is pretty powerful.
Yeah.
And one of the really difficult problems in our field, certainly in trying to recruit staff, which I do since I supervise a division of a library, is getting more minority candidates to fill some of those positions. Here we are sitting here with one African American person. Like, we do not have the cadres of people who are creating the vision of the past. So I would answer it a little differently, I would say. I think, first of all, it's a history, but the Lee Monument's a history, an artifact of the 1890s, not the Civil War, right? First of all.
Course, yeah.
And then secondly, I would say, I see it as a piece of evidence, just like I see a manuscript or a photograph or anything else that can be interpreted. And so I think I do respect, even though like I go back to the problem of, do you preserve things that are really heinous? Like, we preserve the films of Leni Riefenstahl, who was a propagandist for the Nazis. We don't save them because we think they're great or that we believe in what they're pushing. We preserve them because they are essentially historical documents. And that's what these monuments are.
Why
Okay,
are
but
they
let's put it another way.
historical? But why is it historical?
Let's put it another way. Okay, Leni Riefenstahl's
monument
films are
is-
still around, and they're kind of great, artistically speaking.
Unfortunately, yes.
Well, on the other hand, most of Nazi propaganda, most of Nazi symbolism, we haven't preserved. When the Allies won World War II, they scrubbed clean the traces of the Nazis. Exactly the opposite of what the Union did when it won the Civil War. As James McPherson, the great historian of the Civil War, long ago put it, the old adage that history is written by the winners, well, one great exception to that is the Civil War. So, just because it's an old thing, it is certainly true, as you say, as Dr. Kimball says, every object has a history and you can learn something from it. But do we have to keep learning the same things from these same objects just because they're these objects? To be a historian is certainly to do that, for sure. But history is a long history of changing. It's called historiography. One of my heroes is Hayden White, who wrote a book called Meta-History about the desire to have history, the desire to have an African American history, the desire to remake a community and remake its history is where we are now. And I, at least, would not say just because I have this object, it has to be part of every new story.
So I'll contradict myself a little too. I'll say, that is a good point. And certain things are not essential necessarily, but it takes the discernment of the historian. There are plenty of books about Roger Brooke Taney. I can learn everything I need to know about Roger Brooke Taney by reading books, essentially, or going and researching in archival collections. But that bust doesn't speak to that. It speaks to the moment in 1931,
Yeah, of course.
when it was constructed. So this is a very interesting conversation. Anyone else want to jump in on that?
Just one last sentence, on the historical part. It's a phrase out there, every civilization carries the seeds of its own destruction within itself, without looking at the fact of history, the past, the interpretation of it. Yes, highlighting other areas of that history is appropriate. I wouldn't call that remaking, because that's still a fact. It just wasn't highlighted, I think people need to stand up for their right to be able to express that interest. We need to push people to push the separate ideas of different types of monuments. Encourage, have dialogue. My generation just doesn't care as much. I'm gonna be honest, that is the problem. The definition of that is literally similar to what Dr. Kimball was bringing up about factual, contextual information like a manuscript and such. So.
I'd just like to sort of sum up, this is exactly the kind of conversation that has to happen. You scared me a little bit when you first opened about and I agree with you, but destroying to me, or from our point of view, especially with the Taney, or I think it would be the same with any. We have to look out for the folks who need the most attention. Unlike the people here who are open-minded, we have to deal with people who dig in and say, I go back. I remember back when Martin Luther King, when they were making Martin Luther King's birthday legal, and I remember one of the comments coming in was, "Kill some more, and we can have more days off." So I have to come from a completely different place in order to reach people, and so that's why I shy away from that, because they are the people that we have to deal with a lot, and I think that having this kind of conversation, Dean, I'll have to tell you, I love your idea, but I think that it should be initiated by you, because if it comes from us, it'll be received quite differently, and I think that's the point that I have to make. We have carried the load a long time, and you're picking up and understanding that the injustice that happened is what can make those changes that you're talking about happen. So I appreciate the conversation.
Well, unfortunately, I think we probably are running out of time, but I'll use my moderator's prerogative to just say something which maybe lighten the mood a little. So, Salvador Dali was mentioned earlier. He almost had a statue on Monument Avenue. It's actually rather hilarious. He actually lived in Virginia. I think one of the Reynolds metal family put him up. He was a big fan of his. And they were proposing a statue of Sally Tompkins, who was a famous Civil War, only woman who was commissioned in the Confederate Army. She actually ran the Chimborazo Hospital, which was the largest hospital in the world. I mean, it actually was quite amazing what she did. So Dolly did a little rendering of what it ought to look like, and got published in the Richmond papers. And I think it was like a petri dish, and she was St. George slaying a amoeba or something, and there was like a finger holding it up. And of course, people flipped out. It was Richmond, right? So they didn't really see that. They didn't really see the art in it. But think if that existed today. You know, it'd be remarkable. But anyways, thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you all our panelists.
I want to thank you all for coming. One thing that I did want to just throw out there for you to be thinking about when you leave is that we're talking about having an open discussion and that there are different perspectives. What was very challenging, and what I'm not sure we totally were able to do, is get someone who is willing to sit on this panel and represent a very conservative, if you will, don't change it, it should stay perspective. And I think that's both good in a way, that maybe people don't want to be challenged for what they perceive to be a perspective that is maybe not popular. On the other hand, if we're going to have the discussion, we know that people feel that way are out there. We heard them in the public hearings, and yet when we reached out, when Mary and I reached out to try to find people who had expressed that passion, they weren't really comfortable with coming to this forum. So I think that we didn't quite get the breadth of perspectives that are really out there. So my challenge to all of us leaving here is, how do we encourage people to even say things that they're thinking but maybe afraid to put out there because it's still out there, and as long as they're thinking it and not talking about it, it makes it impossible for us to kind of face it and deal with it. This is not a very sophisticated way to say it. In that respect, I thank you all for coming, and I thank the panelists for being willing to have the discussion, and I hope we will continue to do so as a community.
And thanks for all of you.
Thank you.